How do we get where we are?
Well, our problem is we have all of these challenges, but we are not making the solutions that we should be making. So the big challenge in the world today is how can we govern ourselves so that all this wealth that has been generated, all these technologies that have been advanced, serve the human purpose, end poverty, reduce inequality, help kids to get an education, address the climate crisis, rather than sending us deeper and deeper into conflict between rich and poor, between China and the U.S. All of these great challenges are really governance challenges. How do we behave properly in the world? I spend almost every waking hour thinking about these issues because I have been working for and with the United Nations for more than 2 decades now, for 3 Secretaries General of the UN, and we have a very important meeting coming up at the UN in September called the Summit of the Future. Very unusual, but it's exactly to address all of the issues that you just mentioned. What are we doing on this planet so we can avoid disaster and we can find our way to real solutions to the list of challenges that you mentioned. And I'm looking forward to that meeting, and part of the purpose of my trip is to speak with government leaders about that so that we actually arrive in September with some thoughtful ideas and with the governments primed to find solutions.
Share with us some of those solutions. I mean, money should be the solution, not the problem, right? But you said if it's a question about governments, so why is there sort of a gap between, the policies and the implementation and what we're doing with the global finance?
Let me put it this way. Everybody in the world would like to live decently, to live well, to have enough to eat, to have good shelter, to have social protection if some bad thing happens to them, or some kind of weather shock and so forth. Everybody would like to live in peace. So at the UN we talk about the future we want. In other words, what are the goals? And the goals have been described as sustainable development, and that's a term that many people have heard by now. SDGs. It means SDGs are the specific 17 goals that every government, Indonesia, United States, Russia, China, everybody agreed to in 2015. And sustainable development means good living standards, social fairness so that it's not the rich versus the poor, environmental sustainability so that we're not heating the planet to disaster, which we are doing right now, and peace. So those are the 4 objectives. That's the future we want: prosperity, social justice, environmental sustainability, peace and cooperation. So why aren't we getting it? Well, that's where we have to think and understand, what do we need to do? How do we need to change? The good news is, and everybody knows it because we're all living it together, technology, the tools that we have are just moving forward so incredibly fast that we should be able to solve all of this. Take the question of energy. We know we need renewable energy, for example. Well, solar power, which is going to play a big role in the world's future, in Indonesia's future, in America's future, was 100 times more expensive than it is now. It's come down to 1/100th of what it cost just 20 years ago. That's great. We should be able to solve all of this. So it's an example of better tools at hand right now. So we can do so many things now, transforming the energy system, making agriculture much more productive, using all of these digital technologies, making our cities more pleasant, less traffic jams, better able to get around, less spending time in endless commutes, because now we can divide our work sometimes from home, sometimes from a coffee shop, sometimes from an office. So many, many things can be done. But yet, what are we actually seeing in the world right now? Major wars. 2 huge wars. One in Ukraine, one in the Middle East. we're seeing huge tension. Everyone in Indonesia knows that the U.S. and China are in a spat, and everyone's saying, my God, please behave yourselves. And this is where I think diplomacy and problem solving is absolutely essential. So as an economist, I spend a lot of my time saying, look, all we have to do is do this, 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 and this, and we could reduce or end poverty, we could get all the kids in school, we could have a better energy system. And then the government say, well, yes, but, you know, it's not so simple because I have a big donor. They want to continue to do this, or my industrial lobby says they want to continue to do this, or what if we do this, but then China's going to become more powerful than the United States. And all of these obstacles, many of them self-inflicted wounds, I would say, because they don't really stand up to scrutiny. And so what I'm hoping and looking for is that if we think, if we reason, if we logically look at problems, if we have diplomacy and dialogue, what looks impossible right now or just incredibly dangerous can actually be turned towards solutions. And I lead for the UN group called the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. So I love the word solutions. I love the word network because it means global interconnection. And the concept of sustainable development, that's my flag. You know, that's what I always say, which is economic, social, environmental, peace.
ESGs, yes.
That framework. So this network is an idea that I developed together with UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon when he was Secretary General a dozen years ago. The governments had just said, we'll have goals for sustainable development. They became the 17 SDGs. The Secretary General and I discussed the idea of creating a network of think tanks and universities around the world to work on these challenges. First, what should our goals be? And then second, how do we solve them? So now we have 2,000 universities. University of Indonesia is one of the members. We have a network throughout Asia that's very, very active in Cambodia, in Thailand, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in China, Japan, Korea, and so forth. So the network covers the world. It's got 150 countries represented in the network, and it's got about 2,000 universities, and I'm seeing something quite encouraging, which is young people at university want to solve these problems. And the universities want to work on them, which is actually very, very good. Now the universities are even being ranked, as in many of these global rankings, in part on whether they're working on the problem solving, whether they're teaching sustainable development, whether they're engaged in the sustainable development challenges. So that's good. The universities are running, saying, how do we get more involved? So this is the approach that I believe in. We have the goals, but we don't have the solutions yet in place. And I'm working with problem solvers all over the world, including in Indonesia. Indonesia has taken a lead on one major piece of this puzzle, which is the financing, something that you mentioned. How are governments going to pay for the energy transformation or for sustainable agriculture? And the idea that's really come out of Indonesia is what we call blended finance, which is...
We have the G20, the Bali Global Blended Finance Alliance.
Exactly. That started here. That's now a global movement based in Bali. How wonderful, because everybody gets inspired by Bali. And the idea is to use new techniques for finance so that even poor communities, poor villages, remote places have the means to say, yes, we can have solar power, we can have sustainable agriculture, we can protect our forests, because finance is key. It's wonderful to talk about all of these things, but if you don't have the money to make the investments, forget it. One of the first countries actually to say, oh, that works, we could put this into our framework was Indonesia. Bappenas, the planning ministry, did a wonderful job. It was here, was the first time that I was presented as special advisor to the United Nations Secretary General on these goals, with a government structure that said, we're going to do it.
Yeah, and then we have the money, but then if you don't have the right policies, you don't have the right governance, then also that's why we end up where we are.
And what I love about the UN, and it's unique, is at least everyone has to listen to each other. Everyone has to talk to each other. I find it a little bit magical. People are cynical about it. Well, it's a talk shop. But talk is actually a lot better than war.
Yes.
And when you talk, you have to take into account someone's talking to you. They have their interests. They have their solutions. Now, what can we do together?
Okay, but the question is, how long will the talking go on? And I'm curious because you do still have faith in the UN. But I've been following SDGs since it was Millennium Development Goals. So that's
I was there too.
It was like almost 25 years ago. And the goal is actually 2030, which is actually just around the corner when we look at the perspective of things. And I mean, to be honest, I mean, the UN, we did stuff during the pandemic, you know, and trying to get everybody together to deal with COVID-19. But there's areas, for example, particularly on geopolitical issues, that the UN's not really, you know, that influential enough. Now, in terms of the effectiveness and also the target for 2030, these solutions, can they really be implemented, you know, with that kind of speed and collaboration, especially when we have a changing of administration coming up in all these various places, including the US and Indonesia, and what's happening in, you know, with Russia, Ukraine, and then China and everything.
So these particular 17 SDGs were set and voted on unanimously on September 25th, 2015. And then a few weeks later, December 12th, 2015, they gavelled the Paris Climate Agreement. So within a few weeks, two major sets of goals were adopted. And I said, oh, great, let's roll up our sleeves. We have 15 years, let's hurry.
15 years.
And of course, nothing happened. I would say 17 goals. Governments looked at this and said, what are we going to do? This is so complicated. How does this fit our budget? What does this mean? One of the first countries actually to say, oh, that works. We can put this into our framework was Indonesia. Bappenas, the planning ministry, did a wonderful job. It was the first time that I was presented as special advisor to the United Nations Secretary General on these goals with a government structure that said, we're going to do it. I took the Indonesia plan all over the world, say, look, they're doing it. So Indonesia played a very lead role.
It was a Bali roadmap, I remember.
Exactly. But then, you know, most governments first couldn't quite do it. Second, the finance was not there. Then came COVID. And COVID was a disaster for the world. We're still not exactly past that disaster. That in itself
there could be more pandemics
is
in
a
the
long
future.
story. But just to say, major disruption. And then by the time we were getting out of COVID, war in Ukraine, and if that was not bad enough, huge US-China tensions. If that wasn't bad enough, then came the war in Israel and Gaza. And this has been horrible. I've had the chance to testify twice to the UN Security Council in the last 2 years about these issues. I said in my testimony, and I think I was right, and I was analytical, and I said to them, because those are the 15 countries responsible for this under the UN Charter, you can solve these wars, you can end them now, because they have reasons. They don't just come out of the blue. The Israel-Gaza war is because there's no state of Palestine. This is clear. There's no rights of the Palestinian people. We need a state of Palestine. I said, make them the 194th UN member state now. Don't delay. Okay, that's an example. We need to have some respect between the major powers. Where are the tensions between the US and China coming from right now? Two areas. One, China's become big, successful, powerful. I say great.
That's a big country.
1.4 billion people,
Absolutely.
and the living standards have gone up, and I've spent my professional lifetime watching that happen from 1981 onward. My first visit to China was 43 years ago. China was impoverished. I've watched the growth. I've worked with the government. I've trained a lot of Chinese students who are now senior officials. I'm delighted with China's rise, but in the United States it's viewed as, oh my God, they're a rival for us. I say get over it. It's good that China's prosperous, but the specific crisis right now is, of course, over Taiwan. And the problem there is the United States is butting into China's internal affairs, and it should not do so. So my message to the UN Security Council was, behave, give some space. Don't get the whole world involved in superpower spats. Be prudent, be careful. Don't go right up to the other one and try to put your nose into their business. My main recommendation is we all calm down, take a deep breath, and work on the things that we should be working on together. ASEAN with 660 million people, that's a big deal. This is a very important region for the world economy. And Indonesia hosts the Secretariat. Use it. This is an opportunity to help guide the world.
Okay, so this is where Indonesia maybe we can come in. We have, the ASEAN chairmanship, and we have the G20. How do you see? I mean, you come to this part of the world quite often, so you must see us as some kind of at least a beacon of hope.
I think it's,
perhaps message for the new government. What kind of torch should they be bearing?
It is a truism, but it also happens to be true that the world economy is shifting to Asia. So this is very important, the center of gravity. I mean, there's an economy everywhere, but this is more than half the world in Asia, and it's the dynamic part of the world. And we have dynamism in China, of course. We have dynamism throughout ASEAN, including Indonesia having steady 5% growth. And I think things can even accelerate and improve here. We have India now, probably about 20 years behind China in some sense in that rapid advance, but now in a rapid advance stage. Boy, that's good for the Indian Ocean if everyone remains peaceful. You've got a lot of dynamism here, a lot of application of the new technologies, a lot of advances of infrastructure. You have fast rail in the U.S. I'm still praying for fast rail. We have no fast rail. I had to get off.
We have one.
I had to get off my Amtrak train from Washington to New York last week because the train stopped because the track broke down. This is the corridor between the U.S. and Washington, so we don't have this. But ASEAN has this, Asia has this. The Belt and Road Initiative is a very positive initiative because China's saying, let's use 21st century technology to get connected. Wonderful idea. So Indonesia within this scheme, Indonesia is the 4th most populous country in the world. That's a big deal. Your G20 was a big deal. The initiatives on blended finance are a big deal. ASEAN with 660 million people, that's a big deal. This is a very important region for the world economy. And Indonesia hosts the Secretariat. Use it. This is an opportunity to help guide the world. Also to say to the United States and to China, get along, please. We like you both. We can cooperate. We do not choose sides. We don't need to choose sides. And you guys don't even have to have a spat, because that's absolutely the truth. And so I think Indonesia has a huge diplomatic role to play.
We've always been part of the non-aligned movement. We never choose sides unless we're forced to.
And I think ASEAN's extremely important because for every practical thing that Indonesia needs to do, for example, clean energy, we know there needs to be a transformation. That will be easier if it's done at the scale of ASEAN than if it's done simply within Indonesia itself. So thinking regionally will really help on the problem solving. Of course it will help on the diplomacy, it will help on the global voice. So I want to see Indonesia's leadership making ASEAN very strong. I want ASEAN to play a major global economic role, sustainable development role, and diplomatic role. That's one of the reasons I'm here.
Well, I think we're pretty good at, creating big events, coming up with roadmaps. We've got lots of roadmaps and signing up to agreements. We have our own ambitions, to reduce our emission. But the proof is in the pudding. It's in the government. We have this ESG, the environmental, the social and the governance part. I just want to ask the two parts of it. The policy aspect is obviously very, very important into the governance. We have to have good, clean governance. How can Indonesia improve on that, particularly for the new administration? What do they need to kind of checklist? And the other thing is the appetite for business. Obviously, at the end of the day, that's where the money is, and that's. Do you see businesses adopting ESG, and are they, through their own kind of volition, not because it's imposed by some top-down approach, but because sustainability is a key to the success and the profitability of businesses in the long run?
Well, first, you used a word that I use every day, many times a day, because I think it's incredibly important: roadmap. A roadmap is how do we get from here to where we want to go. And there are two different things that societies do and that governments do that are very different from each other. One is a vision. You could have a vision, Indonesia 2045. Where does this country want to be on its 100th anniversary of independence? Great, very important. Where do we want to go? But a vision is not a roadmap. A roadmap is how actually to get there. And my main recommendation to any government, including the incoming government, is be very serious on making that road mapping. Get your best experts, get your universities, get your specialists, use Bapinas, use all of the mechanisms you have, so that you're not just talking about the nice things to do, but how are we really going to do it? And a roadmap has many pieces to it, so it's also not a simple thing. It is, first, what technologies are we going to use to get to where we want to go? Second, what investments do we need to make to upgrade maybe the skills of the population, maybe the physical infrastructure, but what investments? Third, how are we going to pay for all of that? That's a big ticket item. That's expensive. It's not cheap to transform the energy system. It's not cheap to transform the agriculture system. It's not inexpensive to build infrastructure. It's got to be financed. So the finance question becomes absolutely central. To my mind, a roadmap is essential for putting the technologies in place, putting the investment profile very clear. Business will do some part, government has to do another part, and then the financing issues, this blended finance, the private sector part, the public sector part. So I want to see from Indonesia what's the roadmap to decarbonize the energy system. Not just the goal. The goal's fine. What is actually the roadmap? Where is this country going to get its power from? Is it really solar? Where's the solar going to be installed? Do you have the land to do that? Should it be nuclear? If so, is that safe? Where could it be? How many power plants? Is it from Chinese technology? Is it from US technology? Is it from Russian technology? What are the real plans? Because time is short, and even though 2045 may seem like a long time away, in policy making, it is the blink of an eye. It really is the blink of an eye, because by the time you get done planning the siting, doing the engineering, mobilizing the financing, getting the construction done, we're pretty far along.
Unfortunately, governing is a 5-year thing. That's a short-term aspect of it that doesn't help with
for me,
sustainability.
the key, and this is one of the hardest parts for the politicians, is you can't think only or even mainly in 5-year intervals. You can't say, I'm in government, what's my budget next year? Let me get through this to the next crisis. No. What is our roadmap to 2045? My thesis would be for this incoming government, do the homework, take the vision, take the roadmap, figure out what's needed, and I'll bet that you need more revenues than you have in your budget right now.
the financing is, I feel that there is, we in the G20, and we've had all these, forums on the financing aspect. There seems to be, businesses are beginning to catch on to this. What's your thoughts? I mean, then this idea of the blended finance.
I can tell you what's
aspect,
actually happened, which is a huge increase of investments in renewables, but overwhelmingly in a small group of countries, the rich countries, and China. So if you look at the data, there's been a boom, hundreds of billions of dollars per year more of renewables, but it's the U.S., Europe, and China. And a few other places, not Indonesia, not Western Asia, not Sub-Saharan Africa, not Central Asia. We got diverted by geopolitics, we got diverted by COVID, we got diverted by a lack of the right financial institutions, a lack of serious problem solving. We got diverted, of course, by lobbying, by a lot of...
Yes, absolutely. At the end of the day, money talks when it comes to politics, right?
Yeah, but, yes, and we could say, well, it's always like that, but when we're dealing with a global crisis like we're dealing with, we can't play games the way we normally play games. Politicians have children. They have grandchildren. They need to respect the future.
Like you mentioned, there is actually a lot of money out there, isn't it? Particularly in the private sector. It's not that the world is lacking money. It's not that
let's just be clear with some numbers. The world output is more than $100 trillion per year right now, measured at just normal market prices. If you measure it at what we call purchasing power, it's even higher than that. 100 trillion is not small change. Even for a macroeconomist, it's not bad. We save something like 30% of that, consume the rest. But savings are therefore about $30 trillion a year. Okay, we need for this transformation $3 or $4 or $5 trillion. It's a fraction of this large saving. We have the money to do it. We have the financing to do it. We have to make the roadmap real. So that's the main point.
And diverting it to where the money is actually needed, which is
a huge problem, and it's the one that I've, by the way, been dealing with. You could say, well, why don't you have solutions, Mr. Sachs, after all this time? But from the first days of my research as an economist more than 40 years ago, I've been dealing with the question, how do we make that large pool of global saving actually get directed to the problems of poor people, not just the benefits of rich people? The truth is, we still have a global financial system that the money flows to those who already have it, not to those who need it.
Richer.
But it's not impossible, because we have so many cases, so many examples, so many ways to make the money move to those who really need it. A simple example that everybody knows about. We have what we call the multilateral development banks. It's a mouthful, but it's the World Bank, it's the Asian Development Bank, it's the new Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB. It's what's called the new Development Bank in Shanghai. We have all these institutions. What they do is they go to the capital markets and borrow, and then their job is actually to lend to the poorer countries. And they can lend on good terms because they can borrow on good terms. So an obvious point, very obvious, is that what that group of banks does should be scaled up 5 or 10 times. So again, in the G20, Indonesia is going to be there in Brazil. Brazil's the presidency now, just like Indonesia was a couple of years ago. Indonesia, India, South Africa, Russia, other emerging economies need to say no more delay. Come on. It will work, by the way. It really would work if the vast majority of humanity, which is about 6.8 billion people out of the 8 billion on the planet, raise their voice in unison to the 1.2 billion in the rich world and say, stop used to run the world, you don't run the world anymore. We run the world together, you got to do your part. This is what we really need to hear.
The appetite for businesses themselves, have they evolved beyond just business creating profit for their shareholders into something else, like, we talk about impactful, businesses that actually, worry about the community, how they actually make a difference. Do you see the business world moving in that direction, or are they still stuck in this, let's put the money where the best return on interest
Well,
is?
look, I mean, the smart businesses are looking forward because that's where the market's going to be. So they're thinking ahead. You look at China. China has become, because it worked hard at it, now the clear, I think, indisputable world leader in electric vehicles. We are going to be driving electric vehicles in the future. Or maybe we won't be driving them, maybe AI will be driving us, but we'll be riding in them. We're likely to be riding in Chinese vehicles for the next 20 years because BYD and others have become the low-cost, high-quality producers. How did that happen? Well, they didn't say, I'm going to stick with the past. They said, what's coming up? China worked on it. The United States dragged its feet. In the U.S., we had our politicians saying, we don't need that renewable energy stuff. We don't need to change. So the U.S. companies were too slow. We had one good one, Elon Musk and Tesla, which is heavily a Chinese company, actually, because he produces in China. But in general, the politicians said, we don't have to go that way. That's the environmentalists and so forth. So the incumbent companies didn't react. Now what's happening? Now the United States is in a full panic. Oh my God, China's going to take over the world electric vehicle market. We have to protect our markets. Europe is putting up protection as well. So the smart companies are ahead of the curve. The ones that are lobbying and telling governments don't move and it's too hard and so forth, they're trying to hang on. They're not going to be the ones making the big bucks in the end. So smart companies absolutely are already looking forward. Our problem is not the lack of entrepreneurship. The problem is not that businesses are dragging their feet in looking forward. The problem is that some incumbent industries, the old ones, fossil fuels, like in this country, the coal sector, that's a sector that's going to actually shrink because that's what the world needs to have happen. But they don't want that, of course. But the role of politics is to find the ways forward that really work, not just to balance the forces of who's giving campaign contributions and so on. It is to solve the problems.
Blended finances, a blend of what, and how can that be applied in order to give some of that money in this direction?
Blended means two things. It means literally when you do a project that some of that funding is going to come from official or government sources and some is going to come from the capital markets or the banks. It's going to be bonds or it's going to be bank loans, so that when you look at the structure of a project, you're going to see both kinds of capital on the balance sheet. It's going to be solutions that involve this rather more complicated mix of sources. But what it also means is not only the way that things are financed, but the way that projects or initiatives are actually done. Because if this country is going to convert to, and it has to zero carbon energy, private companies will play a big role because you'll have private power generation for sure. But the government's going to have to play a big role also, because I guarantee you those distribution lines that are going to carry the power from whatever solar field or wind or nuclear power plant to the population center, that's going to either be state-owned, probably a state utility, or it's going to be heavily regulated by government. So you can't do it just on a market basis. So both the financing and the design are a mix, and that's what blending means. Now, what it means practically for Indonesia is it's true that public money isn't going to do the heavy lifting for a lot of things, but there's not enough public finance right now. Indonesia has a relatively low amount of tax to national income. Even the taxes that are on the books don't get collected all that well, let's face
around
it.
11%.
So there's a lot of tax evasion, there's a lot of revenue that should be collected that is not being collected. The revenues as a share of the national income is estimated by the International Monetary Fund to be about 16%. That's way too low. Because this government has a big responsibility. You look to the government, oh, you want school feeding? Well, it has to be paid for. You want schools? It has to be paid for. You
Free health?
You want teachers that are qualified? You better pay them a decent salary. You want a health system? Thank you. You don't want that flood or that drought killing your community? Thank you very much. You want physical infrastructure? You want digital connectivity? Okay, part of that can be paid for by the private sector. But what about poor communities? They're not going to be digitally connected unless the government does it. So when we talked about roadmaps, a big part of the roadmap is what does the government actually have to finance? My thesis would be for this incoming government, do the homework, take the vision, take the roadmap, figure out what's needed, and I'll bet that you need more revenues than you have in your budget right now. Now, what are you going to do about it? Either you're going to collect more taxes now, or you're going to put in place a sequence of revenue raising over time. So maybe it starts very small now, but in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, it's not 16% of GDP. Maybe it's 20, maybe it's 25%. I don't want to pull a number out of the hat. I want to link it to the actual roadmap. I want Bappenas to say, this is what we're really going to need so that in 2045 we are where we at. And then the politicians, we don't like that, but this is what we need to do. This is our homework assignment.